The sound of a heavy designer boot meeting a soft target echoed through the restaurant like a crack of thunder. Lee Narin, 8 months pregnant and dressed in the modest black and white uniform of a server, collapsed onto the cold granite floor. Her vision blurred, but her arms moved with a mother's instinct, curling tightly around her stomach to shield her unborn child. Above her stood Choi Min-suk, her former high school tormentor turned chaebol heir. He didn't look down with pity. He looked down with the hunger of a man finally settling a decade-old score.
A Waitress, Narin?
After all that pride in high school, you're finally where you belong, at my feet. He adjusted his silk tie, his laughter joined by the cruel snickers of his entourage. What Min-suk didn't realize, what the patrons and the terrified staff didn't know, was that as Narin hit the floor, her thumb had already pressed the sapphire stone on her ring. It wasn't just jewelry. It was a silent Protocol Zero, alert sent directly to the private phone of Baek Do-kyung, the ghost of Seoul, who was currently parked in a blacked-out sedan exactly 60 seconds away. The Gilded Cage, the most exclusive rooftop restaurant in the city, is a place where the air smells of expensive cologne and old money secrets. It's a glass-walled fortress of the elite, overlooking the neon veins of Seoul. But on this afternoon, the luxury was stained. Amidst a wreckage of spilled organic tea and shards of fine-boned china, Narin lay gasping, her pale skin a stark contrast to the dark floor. The dining room went eerily still. Waiters turned their backs and socialites looked into their wine glasses, refusing to acknowledge the violence. This is the phenomenon of elite blindness, where the wealthy believe they are immune to the consequences of their cruelty. Min-suk thrived in this silence. He began to pace around her, his polished shoes clicking like a ticking clock. I offered you a seat at my table 10 years ago, and you laughed at me. Now look at you. You're nothing but a servant with a belly full of some nobody's mistake. Narin didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply took a jagged breath, her eyes fixed on the entrance. Behind the glass doors, the elevator dings. The ghost isn't coming to save a waitress. He's coming to reclaim his queen. The interior of the black sedan was as quiet as a tomb. Baek Do-kyung sat in the back seat, his eyes closed as he listened to the low hum of the engine. To anyone looking through the tinted glass, he looked like a successful young businessman thinking about his next big deal. He was the picture of calm, his breathing slow and steady, his expensive suit perfectly pressed. But inside, he was always watching. He was known as the Ghost of Seoul because he could see everything without ever being seen. Suddenly, a sharp vibration broke the silence. It didn't come from his phone. It came from a small, specialized device kept in his inner pocket. Do-kyung pulled it out. The screen was dark, except for a single, pulsing blue light. It was the Protocol Zero signal. His heart didn't race, and his hands didn't shake, but his eyes turned cold. That signal only came from one place, the sapphire ring on his wife's finger. Narin was in trouble. He didn't yell or bark orders. He simply tapped the glass partition between him and the driver. The Gilded Cage, Do-kyung said. His voice was a low, dangerous skin.
Now.
The driver didn't ask questions. He saw his boss's face in the rearview mirror and knew that someone had just made a terminal mistake. The car roared to life, weaving through the busy afternoon traffic like a shark through water. As the car sped toward the rooftop restaurant, Do-kyung began to change. He wasn't the loving husband who had kissed Narin goodbye that morning anymore. He was shedding his skin. He reached up and slowly adjusted his luxury watch, clicking the silver clasp into place. It was a small, rhythmic sound, click, click, click. To him, it sounded like a countdown. He pulled a tablet from the seat pocket and swiped his finger across the screen. The restaurant's security feed appeared instantly. He saw the crowd of wealthy people standing in a circle. He saw the broken plates. And then he saw her. Narin was on the floor, her hands curled around her pregnant belly. He saw Choi Min-suk standing over her, his mouth moving in a cruel laugh. A dark, heavy heat began to radiate from Do-kyung's chest. He had spent years building an empire, so he could keep her safe from the world's ugliness. He had given her that restaurant, so she could be a light in a city of shadows. And now, A man with a famous name and a small mind had dared to touch what belonged to the ghost. 60 seconds, sir, the driver whispered, his voice trembling slightly. Du Kyung didn't respond. He smoothed the front of his jacket and checked his cuffs. He looked perfect. He looked elegant. But as the car pulled up to the curb and the heavy doors of the building began to lock down under his remote command, the transformation was complete. The businessman was gone. The predator had arrived. He stepped out of the car and into the lobby. The marble floors clicked under his shoes, matching the steady beat of his heart. He didn't need to run. He didn't need to hurry. The doors were locked, the elevators were under his control, and the man who had kicked his wife had nowhere left to hide. It was time to show Choi Min-suk the difference between having money and having power. The heavy scent of incense always filled the private halls of the palace, but on the day of the wedding, it felt thick enough to choke. Naren sat perfectly still as the servants layered heavy, embroidered silk over her shoulders. The red fabric was the color of fresh blood, a reminder of the power she was about to join. Outside the doors, the world knew Du Kyung as a monster. They called him the Iron King, a man whose heart was made of cold flint and whose hands were always stained with the dust of battle. But as the heavy crown was placed on Naren's head, she did not tremble. She knew a secret that the generals and the peasants did not. Even the sharpest blade needs a sheath. The ceremony was a blur of bowing officials and low chanting. When she finally stood beside him, the air around Du Kyung felt hot, like the heat coming off a desert path at noon. He didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, dark and full of a restless storm. His hand, resting on the hilt of his sword, was squeezed so tight his knuckles were white. He looked like a man ready to tear the world apart just to see if it would break. That evening, the celebration turned loud and wild. In the great hall, the soldiers drank until their faces were red, and the noise of crashing cups echoed against the stone walls. A young guard made a small mistake. He tripped, spilling a few drops of wine onto Du Kyung's dark boot. The room went silent instantly. The music stopped. The soldiers froze with their meat halfway to their mouths. Du Kyung stood up slowly. The chair scraped against the floor like a scream. His face didn't show anger. It showed nothing at all, which was much worse. He reached for the heavy silver pitcher on the table, his fingers twitching. Everyone knew what happened next when the king grew bored or insulted. He was a fire that burned everything it touched. The young guard fell to his knees, shaking so hard his teeth rattled. Naren felt the shift in the room. She didn't call out and she didn't show fear. Instead, she moved with the grace of a falling leaf. She reached out and placed her small, cool hand directly over Du Kyung's fist. For a second, he stiffened. His muscles were like cords of wood under her touch. He looked down at her hand, then up into her eyes. He saw no judgment there, only a calm, steady light. Naren leaned in close, her voice a soft whisper that only he could hear over the sudden silence of the hall. She spoke of the gardens they would plant and the quiet of the mountains. She didn't beg him to stop. She simply reminded him who he was when the armor came off. The tension left his body all at once. It was as if she had pulled a thorn from a lion's paw. His fingers loosened their grip on the silver pitcher. He took a deep breath, and the storm in his eyes faded into a dull ember. "Clean it up," Du Kyung said to the guard. His voice was rough, but the violence was gone. The hall exhaled. The music started again, but it was softer now. Du Kyung sat back down, but he didn't reach for his wine. Instead, he kept his hand near Naren's. He was a man who could command an army of thousands, yet he was ruled by the gentle touch of the woman beside him. She was the iron lily, beautiful and delicate to the eye, but strong enough to hold back a king's rage. As the moon rose over the palace, Naren realized her life would be a constant dance on the edge of a knife, but as long as she held his hand, the blade would never fall. Min-suk stood by the window, watching the smoke from his cigarette curl into the cold night air. Down in the courtyard, he could see the shadows of guards moving like ghosts. His mind was not on the security of the estate, however. It was fixed on the woman he had seen earlier.
Naren.
Even after all these years, The mere sight of her made his blood boil with a mixture of heat and ice. He remembered the day he had asked her to be his. It was long before the Iron King had claimed her, back when they were both young and the world seemed full of paths to take. He had cornered her in the peach orchard, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He had offered her everything he had, which wasn't much back then, but he had promised her greatness. She had looked at him with those calm, clear eyes, the same eyes she used now to settle a warlord, and she had simply said no. She hadn't been mean about it. She had been polite, which felt 1,000 times worse than a slap. To Naren, Min-suk was never a choice. He was just a shadow in the background of her life. That rejection had twisted something deep inside him. Every time he saw her sitting beside Du-kyung, draped in silks and jewels, he felt a sharp pain in his chest. He didn't just want her anymore. He wanted to break the world that had chosen her over him. He hated the way she looked at the king, and he hated even more the way the king looked at her. Min-suk let out a low, dry laugh. He leaned his forehead against the cool glass of the window. He felt a strange sense of safety tonight, a false peace that made him feel like he was finally the one in control. He believed he was smarter than everyone in the palace. While Du-kyung relied on brute force and Naren relied on her quiet influence, Min-suk relied on secrets. He had spent years gathering whispers and watching for cracks in the foundation of their power. He felt like a spider in the center of a very large web. In his mind, he was untouchable. Du-kyung trusted him to manage the details of the household, and Naren likely didn't even remember the boy from the orchard. This was his greatest advantage. They saw him as a servant, a tool to be used and put away. They didn't see the fire burning behind his eyes. "You think you are so high above me," he whispered to the empty room. "But the higher you sit, the farther you have to fall." He imagined the look on Naren's face when everything they had built started to crumble. He didn't want her dead, not yet. He wanted her to see him as the one holding the matches while her world went up in flames. He wanted her to realize that the man she had rejected was the one who could finally bring the Iron King to his knees. He took one last pull from his cigarette and crushed it out on the windowsill, leaving a dark, ugly mark on the white wood. He smiled, feeling a dark joy. He was patient. He had waited years for this feeling of power, and he was sure that, very soon, the palace would belong to the shadows. The quiet of the evening was broken by a sudden, heavy thud. Naren looked up from her table just as the thick metal shutters of the restaurant slammed shut. The sound was like a prison door closing, cutting off the light from the street and the distant hum of the city. For a moment, the air inside felt trapped and still. The bright neon signs outside were replaced by the dim, warm glow of the indoor lanterns, casting long and flickering shadows across the floor. Naren did not move. She felt a familiar chill run down her spine, the kind she used to feel back in the palace when the guards would change shifts. She looked around the room and noticed a strange shift. The normal sounds of a kitchen, the clinking of spoons, the hiss of steam, and the chatter of the cooks, simply vanished. It was as if someone had turned off the world. The waiters, who had been rushing back and forth with plates of steaming noodles just moments ago, stopped in their tracks. One man stood with a tray balanced on his hand, but he didn't move a muscle. Another woman stopped wiping a table and set her cloth down slowly. They didn't look scared. They looked ready. They didn't look at the customers or at the food. Every single eye in the room turned toward the heavy wooden doors of the entrance. Then, as if they were all moved by the same string, the entire staff turned toward the door and bowed. They bent their backs low, their foreheads almost touching their knees. It was a deep, respectful bow that was reserved only for someone of great power. It was the kind of bow that meant a master had arrived. Naren realized then that this was not just a restaurant. This was a place where people knew exactly who she was, and more importantly, they knew who was coming for her. The red curtains near the windows seemed to pulse in the low light, making the room feel like it was bleeding. She could hear the faint sound of footsteps outside, heavy and steady, crunching on the gravel. The staff stayed in their bow, frozen like statues in a museum. The silence was so heavy that Naren could hear her own heart beating. She knew that the lockdown had begun. There was no way out through the front, and she knew without looking that the back exits were likely blocked too. The false sense of safety she had felt while eating was gone, replaced by the cold reality of her past. She stood up slowly, her silk dress rustling in the quiet room. She didn't try to run. She knew that in this world, running only made the hunters faster. Instead, she smoothed her skirts and waited. The shutters were down, the world was locked out, and the stage was set for whatever was about to walk through those doors. She looked at the bowing staff and felt a surge of sadness. They were a reminder that no matter how far she traveled, the shadow of the Iron King followed her, turning every peaceful corner into a fortress of red and steel. The heavy wooden doors didn't fly open with a bang. Instead, they swung inward slowly, letting in a gust of cold night air that made the lanterns flicker and dance. Du-kyung walked into the room with a calm that was more frightening than any shout. He was not the wild, screaming warrior from the rumors or the messy sketches on a tavern wall. He was a mountain of still, dark stone. He wore a long black coat that brushed against his boots, and his face was as smooth and unreadable as a frozen lake. As he moved toward the center of the room, he passed a table where a stack of plates had been left near the edge. His sleeve caught the porcelain, and the plates tumbled to the ground. The sound of the crash was deafening in the silent restaurant. Shards of white ceramic exploded across the floor like tiny pieces of ice. A bowl shattered nearby, sending a splash of dark sauce across the wood. The staff remained in their deep bows, trembling but unmoving. The mess was chaotic, broken edges and spilled food everywhere, but Du-kyung didn't even glance down. He didn't flinch at the noise. He didn't apologize. He simply kept walking through the sea of sharp glass, his heavy boots crushing the smaller pieces into dust with a dry, grinding sound. He stopped at the table where Naren stood. For a long moment, he just looked at her. The air between them felt like a pulled bowstring, ready to snap. The contrast was terrifying. Around them was the ruin of the plates and the fear of the servants, but Du-kyung was perfectly composed. He pulled out the chair across from her. The wooden legs scraped against the floor, a slow and deliberate sound that seemed to last forever. He sat down and folded his large, scarred hands on the table. He looked like a king sitting on a throne, even in this small, locked-up noodle shop. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't call for his guards. He just sat there in the middle of the mess, his dark eyes fixed on Naren's face. "You left without saying goodbye," he said. His voice was low and steady, lacking any trace of the rage she had expected. Naren looked at the broken porcelain at his feet, and then back at his calm expression. The stillness in him was far more dangerous than the violence she had seen in the palace. When he was angry, he was a fire she could put out. But tonight, he was the cold, deep ocean, and she realized that the lockdown wasn't just to keep her in. It was to make sure the rest of the world stayed out while the Iron King finally spoke to his queen. She sat down across from him, her hands trembling under the table, as the silence of the restaurant wrapped around them like a heavy shroud. While Du-kyung sat perfectly still across from Naren, his hands remained folded on the table. He did not need to move to cause destruction. He simply nodded toward a phone sitting on the table between them. Min-suk, who had been standing in the corner trying to look important, felt a sudden cold sweat break out on his forehead. He had felt so safe only moments ago, but now the air in the room felt thin and sharp. The first sign of ruin was a small digital chirp. Min-suk's phone buzzed with a message from his bank. He glanced at the screen and felt his heart skip a beat. Every single one of his credit cards had been frozen. The wealth he had used to hide his secrets was gone in the blink of an eye. He looked at Du-kyung, but the king did not even look back. To Du-kyung, erasing a man's fortune was as simple as blowing out a candle. Min-suk realized then that his safety had been a lie. He had only been wealthy because the king allowed it. A few minutes later, the phone buzzed again. This time it was an official notice from his landlord. His luxury apartment, the place where he kept all his expensive suits and stolen records, was no longer his. The lease had been terminated immediately. He was being told to vacate by dawn. It was a cold, calculated move. In less than 10 minutes, Min-suk had gone from a powerful man to someone with no money and no home. He was being stripped bare, layer by layer, while the staff in the restaurant watched in total silence. The final blow came with a third ring. This time, the phone didn't just show a text, it was a call. Do-kyung reached out one finger and tapped the speakerphone. A voice filled the small, quiet space of the restaurant. It was Min-suk's father. But it wasn't the strong, stern voice Min-suk remembered. The old man's voice was trembling, sounding small and very old. "Min-suk," his father whispered, his breath catching. "What have you done? Men are here. They're taking everything. They said you have offended the Iron King. Please tell me this is a mistake." The sound of his father's fear was worse than the loss of the money or the apartment. It was the sound of a family name being erased. Min-suk looked at the phone, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He had thought he was the spider in the web, but he finally saw that he was just a fly. Do-kyung had not raised a hand or a sword, yet he had destroyed Min-suk's entire world while sitting at a dinner table. Do-kyung finally looked up, his dark eyes locking onto Min-suk. There was no anger in his gaze, only a terrible, flat boredom. He had dismantled a man's life as easily as someone might peel an orange. Naren watched the phone, her heart heavy. She knew this was the side of Do-kyung that the world feared. He didn't just beat his enemies. He made it so they had never existed at all. The restaurant felt colder than ever as the trembling voice on the phone faded into a long, haunting silence. Min-suk stood frozen, his eyes darting from the silent phone to the man sitting at the table. The air in the restaurant felt like it was pressing against his chest, making it hard to breathe. He looked at Naren, then back at Do-kyung, his mind spinning as he tried to connect the dots. He had spent years clinging to his anger and his pride, thinking he was better than the woman who had turned him down. He had convinced himself she was just a girl who had gotten lucky, or perhaps a trophy hidden away in a palace. The silence was broken by the sound of heavy footsteps. From the shadows near the kitchen and the darkened corners of the room, 4 men stepped forward. They weren't like the regular restaurant staff. These men were tall, broad-shouldered, and wore dark suits that looked like armor. They moved with a synchronized smoothness that only came from years of training. They didn't look at Min-suk. They didn't even look at Do-kyung. Their focus was entirely on Naren. They formed a semicircle around her chair, creating a wall of muscle and steel. It was a shield that no one could break. As they stood there, the reality of the situation finally crashed down on Min-suk like a falling mountain. These weren't just guards. These were the elite protectors of the Iron King's inner circle. They were here for her. Naren stood up slowly. Her movements were calm and graceful, showing no signs of the panic that was visible on Min-suk's pale face. As she rose, the guards stepped back just enough to give her room, but they remained close, their hands hovering near their jackets. The way they looked at her wasn't just about duty. It was about deep, unshakable respect. Min-suk's knees felt weak. He realized that all this time, he hadn't just been stalking an old flame or a woman who had moved on. He had been chasing a ghost that belonged to a monster. He had seen her as a prize he had lost, but the rest of the city saw her as something else entirely. She wasn't just a woman who had married well. She was the only person who could walk through the fire of Do-kyung's world and come out untouched. "You didn't know," Naren said softly, her voice echoing in the still room. Min-suk tried to speak, but no words came out. He looked at her silk dress, the way the light caught the fine embroidery, and the way the guards stood like statues around her. The truth was finally clear. He wasn't looking at a simple girl from his past. He was looking at the wife of the most feared man in the city. He was looking at the woman who held the heart of the Iron King in her hands. The weight of his mistake was so heavy it felt like it would crush him. He had thought he was playing a clever game of cat and mouse, but he had actually been walking directly into a lion's den with a flashlight. Every plan he had made, every bit of hate he had nurtured, was nothing more than dust. As Naren looked at him with pity, Min-suk realized his life was over. Not because of a weapon, but because he had finally seen the truth of who she was. The Iron Lily was not just a name, it was a warning he had ignored for far too long. The air in the restaurant felt as heavy as lead. Min-suk's legs finally gave out, and he sank to his knees on the hard floor, surrounded by the broken white shards of the plates Do-kyung had crushed. He looked up at the king, his face wet with sweat and tears. The silence was so deep that the sound of Min-suk's jagged breathing seemed to fill the entire room. Do-kyung didn't move. He sat with his back straight, his dark eyes watching the man on the floor as if he were looking at a bug he was deciding whether to step on. Finally, Do-kyung leaned forward just an inch. The light from the lanterns caught the sharp line of his jaw. He didn't look angry. He looked like a judge who had already finished the trial. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, silver coin, flipping it onto the table. It spun with a ringing sound before wobbling to a stop between them. "I am a fair man, Min-suk," Do-kyung said. His voice was smooth and cold, like a stone at the bottom of a river. "I will give you a choice. I will offer you a gift that most men in your position never get. You have 2 paths out of this room." Min-suk wiped his nose with his sleeve, hope flickering in his eyes for a split second. He leaned forward, desperate to hear a way out of the nightmare he had built for himself. Do-kyung held up one finger. "The first path is simple. My men will call the police. I have a folder full of every lie you have told, every dollar you have stolen, and every person you have hurt to get ahead. You will go to a cold cell for a very, very long time. You will lose your name, and you will never see the sun without bars in front of it." Min-suk shivered. The thought of a dark prison cell made his skin crawl. He had always lived in luxury, and he couldn't imagine a life without fine clothes and soft beds. But then, Do-kyung held up a second finger. "The second path," the king continued, his voice dropping to a low whisper that made the guards in the room stiffen. "The second path is that we stay here. I will tell my men to leave. I will tell my wife to wait in the car. The doors will stay locked, and you and I will have 5 minutes alone in this room. Just 5 minutes. If you are still standing when the clock stops, you walk away a free man. No police, no folders, no debts. You can go back to your life." Min-suk looked at Do-kyung's hands. They were large, scarred, and steady. He looked at the wreckage of the porcelain on the floor, crushed into powder by the king's boots. He remembered the stories of men who had crossed the Iron King, men who had disappeared or been found broken in the streets. He looked into Do-kyung's eyes and saw a darkness that was deeper than any prison cell. There was no mercy there, only the promise of a pain he couldn't even imagine. The silence stretched on. Naren watched from behind the line of guards, her face pale. She knew what those 5 minutes would mean. She knew that for a man like Do-kyung, 5 minutes was more than enough time to finish a soul. Min-suk's gaze broke. He looked at the floor, his shoulders slumped in total defeat. The pride that had fueled him for years was gone, replaced by a hollow, shaking fear. He knew he was a coward, and in this moment, he didn't care who saw it. "The police," Min-suk sobbed, his voice breaking. He fell forward, pressing his forehead against the cold, dirty wood of the floor. "Please, call the police. I want the police." Do-kyung didn't smile, but a shadow of something like disappointment crossed his face. He stood up slowly, the chair making a sharp sound against the floor. He didn't say another words. "Take him away," Do-kyung commanded. As the guards grabbed Min-suk by the arms and dragged him toward the back exit, the man kept crying out, thanking the king for the mercy of a prison cell. It was the ultimate humiliation. Do-kyung walked over to Naren and offered her his hand. His touch was suddenly gentle, the fire hidden away once more. He led her toward the front doors, leaving the broken plates and the broken man behind. The lockdown was over, but the price of the night had been paid in full. The morning sun struggled to peek through the heavy metal shutters as they were finally raised. The screeching sound of the iron echoed in the empty street, a sharp contrast to the terrifying silence of the night before. Inside, the restaurant was a mess. The smell of spilled soy sauce and cold steam hung in the air. Naren walked through the front doors, her footsteps quiet on the wood. She was no longer wearing the silk dress of a queen. She wore a simple, dark coat, but the way the sunlight hit her face made her look more powerful than ever. The staff was already there, lined up near the kitchen. They looked exhausted, their eyes red from a night without sleep. At the front of the line stood the manager. He was a tall man with a stiff collar and a face that usually held a look of great importance. He bowed quickly as Naren approached, his hands shaking at his sides. "Madam," the manager said, his voice oily and thin. "We have cleaned most of the glass. We are ready to open for the lunch rush. I have already scolded the staff for the unpleasantness last night. It will not happen again." Naren stopped in front of him. She didn't look at the floor or the clean tables. She looked directly into the manager's eyes. She remembered how he had stood by the door last night, perfectly still, watching as Min-suk had cornered her. He had been the first to bow to the danger, and the last to offer any help. He had protected his restaurant, but he had not protected the people inside it. When the shutters went down, Naren said, her voice calm but as sharp as a razor, "You disappeared into the shadows. You watched a woman be threatened, and you did nothing because you were afraid of losing your title. A leader who only leads when it is safe is no leader at all." The manager's face went pale. "I was only following the rules of the house, madam. I had to think of the business." "The business is built on people," Naren interrupted. She turned away from him as if he were no longer there. "Pack your things. You are finished here." The room went silent. The manager opened his mouth to argue, but one look at the two dark-suited guards standing by the door silenced him. He hung his head and walked toward the back office, his shoulders slumped in shame. Naren's eyes scanned the rest of the staff. Her gaze landed on a young man at the very end of the line. He was wearing a damp apron, and his hands were red and chapped from scrubbing pots in the back. He was the dishwasher, a boy who usually went unnoticed by everyone. But Naren remembered him. When the plates had first started to break, he was the only one who had stepped forward from the kitchen, a heavy wooden rolling pin in his hand, ready to defend a stranger against a king's wrath. "You," Naren said, gesturing for him to come forward. The boy stumbled a bit, looking confused. "Me, madam? I was just going to finish the pans." "What is your name?" she asked. "Ji-hoon," he whispered. "Ji-hoon. You showed more courage with a piece of wood than a man with a title showed with all his authority," Naren said. She looked at the rest of the staff, making sure they were all listening. "From this moment on, you are the manager of this house. You will learn the books and you will learn the trade. But more importantly, you will teach these people that we do not bow to fear." Ji-hoon's eyes went wide. The other waiters looked at each other in shock, but then, one by one, they began to nod. A new energy filled the room, one that wasn't built on terror, but on a strange, new hope. Naren watched as the young man took off his apron, his hands still shaking but his head held a little higher. She knew the Iron King's shadow would always be near, but in this small corner of the world, she had planted something different. She had established a new order, and as she walked back out into the bright morning light, she felt, for the first time, that the restaurant finally belonged to her. The hospital hallway was quiet, filled only with the soft hum of machines and the distant sound of a nurse's footsteps. The white walls looked clean and bright under the morning sun, a far cry from the dark, smoke-filled restaurant. At the very end of the hall, two of Dookyung's guards stood like stone towers outside a private door. They didn't move or speak, but their presence made the entire floor feel as safe as a mountain fortress. Inside the room, the air was warm and smelled of lavender. Naren sat in a comfortable chair by the window, cradling a small, soft bundle in her arms. The baby was fast asleep, his tiny hands tucked under his chin. He was a miracle of peace in a world that had been so loud and violent only hours before. Naren looked down at him, her heart finally feeling light. The doctors had finished their checks, and the news was good. The stress of the night had not hurt the child. He was safe, hidden away from the shadows of Min-suk and the reach of the Iron King's enemies. The door opened with a gentle click. Dookyung walked in, but he didn't look like the terrifying man who had crushed porcelain under his boots. He had taken off his heavy black coat, and his movements were slow and careful, as if he were afraid the mere sound of his breathing might wake the sleeping boy. He walked over to Naren and stood behind her, placing a large, warm hand on her shoulder. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They simply watched the baby breathe. The chaos of the lockdown, the fear of the rejection, and the ruin of Minsuk's life felt like a dream from a lifetime ago. Here, in the quiet light of the hospital, the only thing that mattered was the tiny life they held between them. "He looks like you," Du-kyung whispered, his voice rare and soft. Naren smiled, leaning her head back against his arm. "He has your stubbornness." He didn't cry once during the exam. Du-kyung looked out the window at the city below. From up here, the streets looked like small veins, and the people looked like tinies moving about their day. They had no idea that a king had stopped the world just to protect this one room. He thought about all the battles he had fought and all the power he had spent years building. People feared his name and trembled at his strike, but as he looked at his wife and his son, he realized that those people understood nothing about real strength. He leaned down, his face close to Naren's. "The world thinks I am powerful because I can break things," he said, his voice steady and deep. "But they're wrong. True power isn't in the strike. It isn't in the sword or the money I can take away." He reached out a single finger and gently touched the baby's velvet-soft cheek. The infant stirred but did not wake, feeling the warmth of his father's hand. "True power," Du-kyung continued, looking into Naren's eyes, "is the ability to make the entire world stop moving just for the one you love. Everything I have built, every wall, and every guard, was for this moment of quiet. As long as you are both safe, I am the most powerful man alive." Naren reached up and squeezed his hand. The Iron Lily and the Iron King were no longer figures of legend or targets for greedy men. In this room, they were simply a father and a mother. The dragon had pulled in its claws and curled around its treasure, ensuring that the fire of the outside world would never touch them again. Outside, the city continued its noisy rush, but inside the room, there was only the sound of a peaceful breath and the unbreakable promise of a man who would move heaven and earth to keep it that way.